The rain fell softly on the small cemetery in Asheville, North Carolina, as if the sky itself was mourning. Margaret Hayes had been laid to rest under a sprawling oak tree, her casket surrounded by flowers that seemed too bright for such a gray day. She had been only 48 years old when cancer took her, leaving behind a husband, a fortune, and a German shepherd named Atlas. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the gathering, her navy uniform pressed and perfect despite the drizzle. She wasn't family. She wasn't even a close friend. But Margaret had been her mentor once, back when Sarah was just a frightened girl trying to survive basic training. Margaret had been a military spouse who volunteered at the base, offering guidance to young female recruits who felt lost in a world that still questioned whether they belonged. "You're stronger than you know," Margaret had told Sarah 10 years ago, her hand warm on Sarah's shoulder. "Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Sarah had carried those words through 2 deployments, through countless moments when male soldiers dismissed her, through nights when she questioned everything. And now Margaret was gone. Across the cemetery, Sarah watched Margaret's husband, Richard Hayes, stand stiff and dry-eyed beside the casket. He was a tall man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled even in the rain. His face showed no emotion as the pastor spoke about love and loss and eternal rest. Beside Richard stood Atlas, the massive German shepherd that Margaret had rescued 3 years ago. The dog sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the casket as if he understood that his world had just ended. His fur was soaked through, but he didn't move. He didn't shake off the water. He just sat there, grieving in the way only dogs can grieve, with complete and utter stillness. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She knew what Atlas meant to Margaret. The dog had been her constant companion during the long months of treatment, lying beside her hospital bed, resting his head on her lap during chemotherapy. Margaret had told Sarah in their last phone call, just 2 weeks before she died, "Promise me you'll check on Atlas. Richard never wanted him. He tolerates him for my sake, but I worry about what will happen when I'm gone." Sarah had promised. She had promised because that's what you did for someone who saved you when you needed saving most. The funeral ended with the lowering of the casket. People began to disperse, walking quickly toward their cars to escape the rain. Sarah waited, watching as Richard turned away from the grave without a backward glance. Atlas remained seated, his eyes still on the disturbed earth where Margaret now lay. "Come on, dog," Richard said sharply, not even looking back. "Let's go." Atlas didn't move. Richard stopped, his jaw tightening with irritation. "I said come." The dog finally turned his head to look at his owner's husband, but he didn't stand. There was something almost defiant in that gaze, a refusal that made Sarah's chest ache. Richard walked back, grabbed Atlas by the collar, and yanked him to his feet. The dog stumbled, then followed reluctantly as Richard dragged him toward a black Mercedes parked on the cemetery road. Sarah watched them go, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. She made her way to her rental car and followed at a distance. Richard lived in the wealthy suburb of Biltmore Forest, in a mansion that Margaret's family money had paid for. Sarah had visited once, years ago, and remembered how out of place Atlas had seemed among the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. She parked down the street and waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The rain slowed to a mist. Sarah was about to give up and come back tomorrow when the front door of the mansion opened. Richard emerged, and he was alone. He walked to his Mercedes, got in, and drove away without a glance back at the house. Sarah frowned. Where was Atlas? She waited another 20 minutes, then walked up the long driveway. The house was silent, no lights visible from the front. She went around to the back, where Margaret had always kept a small garden, and that's when she heard it. Barking. Desperate, frantic barking. Sarah ran toward the sound and found Atlas in the backyard, tied to a tree with a short length of rope. There was no food, no water, no shelter. The dog was soaking wet, shivering, barking at the back door of the house as if he believed Margaret would come out at any moment and save him. "Oh, buddy," Sarah whispered, her heart breaking. What did he do to you? She approached slowly, speaking in soft tones. Atlas stopped barking when he saw her, his tail giving a single, hesitant wag. He remembered her from her visits to see Margaret. Sarah untied the rope with shaking fingers. The knot was tight, clearly meant to keep the dog secured for a long time. Maybe forever. She checked Atlas over. He was thin, thinner than he should be, and his ribs showed through his wet fur. Richard had clearly stopped caring for him the moment Margaret entered hospice. "Come on, boy," Sarah said quietly. "You're coming with me." Atlas followed her to the car without resistance. He climbed into the back seat and immediately lay down, exhausted. Sarah grabbed an old blanket from her trunk and wrapped it around him, then sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, trying to control her anger. She pulled out her phone and called the one person she knew who might be able to help, Jake Hawkins, a Navy SEAL she'd served with on her last deployment. Jake was stationed at Fort Bragg now, only 2 hours away, and he'd been trained in K-9 operations. More importantly, he was someone who understood loyalty and wouldn't ask stupid questions. "Mitchell," Jake answered on the second ring, his voice warm with surprise. "Long time. What's wrong?" "I need help," Sarah said simply. "And I think you're going to want to hear this story." She told him everything, about Margaret, about Richard, about finding Atlas tied up and abandoned. About the promise she'd made. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm off duty this weekend. Send me the address. I'll be there by morning." "Thank you," Sarah breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Jake replied. "But Mitchell? You did the right thing. That dog deserves better." Sarah hung up and looked in the rearview mirror. Atlas was watching her with those intelligent brown eyes, and for just a moment, she saw Margaret in them, that same gentle strength, that same refusal to give up. "We're going to figure this out," Sarah told the dog. "I promise." She started the car and drove away from the mansion, toward the modest hotel where she was staying. Behind her, Richard Hayes' perfect house stood cold and empty in the mist, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something about all of this was very, very wrong. Margaret had been wealthy in her own right, from family money that predated her marriage to Richard. She'd been generous, always donating to veteran causes and animal shelters. And she died so suddenly, even with cancer. The doctors had said she should have had at least another year. Sarah pushed the thoughts away. She was tired, grief-stricken, and probably seeing conspiracies where there were none. Richard was just a cold man who'd never loved his wife's dog. That was all. But as she drove through the rainy streets of Asheville with Atlas sleeping fitfully in the back seat, Sarah couldn't shake Margaret's last words to her on the phone, "If anything happens to me, Sarah, please don't let Richard win. He's not who I thought he was. Promise me you'll be careful." Sarah had thought Margaret was just being dramatic, her mind clouded by pain medication. Now she wasn't so sure. Now she wondered what Margaret had known, and what she'd been trying to warn her about. Sarah woke to the sound of Atlas whimpering in his sleep. She'd set up a makeshift bed for him in the hotel room using extra blankets, and he'd collapsed onto it around midnight, too exhausted to eat the food she'd bought him. Now, in the gray light of dawn, the dog was dreaming, his paws twitching, soft sounds of distress escaping his throat. "It's okay, buddy," Sarah murmured, kneeling beside him. She placed her hand gently on his side, feeling his rapid heartbeat beneath her palm. "You're safe now." Atlas's eyes opened, and for a moment, he looked confused, searching for something, someone, who would never appear again. Then his gaze found Sarah, and he seemed to remember. His tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture so heartbreaking in its resignation that Sarah had to look away. A knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah checked her watch, 0600 hours. Right on time. She looked through the peephole and saw Jake standing there, a duffel bag over his shoulder and 2 coffee cups in his hands. Even in civilian clothes, jeans and a black jacket, he carried himself with that unmistakable military bearing. She opened the door, and Jake's serious expression softened into a small smile. "Mitchell. You look like hell." "Nice to see you too, Hawk," Sarah replied, but she couldn't help smiling back. Jake had been her swim buddy during advanced training, one of the few men who treated her like an equal instead of a liability. They'd saved each other's lives more than once overseas. Jake stepped inside, and his attention immediately went to Atlas. The dog had risen to his feet, wary but not aggressive. Jake set down the coffee cups and slowly extended his hand, letting Atlas sniff him. "Hey there, soldier," Jake said quietly. "Rough couple of days?" Atlas's tail wagged hesitantly, and Jake ran his hands over the dog's body with the practiced ease of someone who'd worked with military working dogs before. Sarah watched as Jake checked Atlas's teeth, his paws, felt along his ribs. "He's malnourished," Jake said, his voice hardening. "Not just from the last few days either. This has been going on for weeks, maybe months. See how his coat looks dull? That's protein deficiency. And these pressure sores on his elbows? He's been lying on hard surfaces without proper bedding for a long time." Sarah felt her anger reignite. Margaret was too sick to notice. And that bastard Richard took advantage of the situation, Jake finished. He stood, his jaw set. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." They sat on the hotel room's small couch, and Sarah laid it all out. She told Jake about Margaret's mentorship, about her marriage to Richard Hayes, a real estate developer who'd seemed charming at first but grew increasingly controlling over the years. About how Margaret's family money had funded Richard's business ventures, and how she told Sarah in those last weeks that she was planning to change her will. "She never got the chance," Sarah said quietly. "She went downhill so fast. One week she was talking about plans for the future, and the next week she was in hospice, barely conscious." Jake's eyes narrowed. "How fast are we talking?" 2 weeks from diagnosis to death. The doctor said the cancer was aggressive, but... Sarah trailed off, voicing the thought that had been haunting her. "Jake, what if it wasn't just cancer?" The room fell silent except for Atlas's breathing. Jake took a long drink of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "You're thinking someone helped it along," he said finally. "I'm thinking Margaret was worth $20 million. I'm thinking she told me she was changing her will. I'm thinking her husband showed no emotion at her funeral and abandoned her dog, the thing she loved most, the same day he buried her." Sarah met Jake's gaze. "Am I crazy?" "No," Jake said slowly. "But we'd need proof. Real proof. And that's not easy to come by. Margaret was cremated. Richard pushed for it, said it was what she wanted." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "There's no body to examine now." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. Atlas followed him, sitting at his feet with that same patient loyalty. Jake absently scratched the dog's ears. "Tell me about Atlas," Jake said. "Margaret rescued him, you said?" 3 years ago. He was found abandoned at a warehouse, half-starved, with signs of abuse. Margaret saw his picture at a shelter and drove 2 hours to get him." Sarah smiled at the memory. "She called me that night, so excited. Said she'd found her soulmate in dog form." "Did Richard ever interact with the dog?" "Never. He called Atlas a mongrel even though the dog is clearly a purebred German shepherd. Complained about the hair, the noise, the expense." Sarah paused. "But Margaret had her own money. Richard couldn't stop her." Jake turned back to face her, and there was something sharp in his eyes now, the look he got when a mission was coming together in his mind. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "You're going to make a call to Richard Hayes. Tell him you're a friend of Margaret's, and you heard about Atlas. Tell him you'd like to formally adopt the dog, make it all legal. See how he reacts." "Why would we want to make it legal?" I already have Atlas. Because, Jake said with a slight smile, Richard doesn't know that. And I want to see if he's anxious to have the dog gone, or if he's going to fight to keep him. That'll tell us something. Sarah nodded slowly. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to call in a favor. Jake pulled out his phone. I know a guy at the VA hospital who worked in toxicology before he joined the Navy. If Richard was poisoning Margaret, there are ways to do it that mimic or accelerate cancer symptoms. I want to know what those methods are and what evidence they might leave behind. The cremation might not have destroyed everything, Jake interrupted. There's still Margaret's medical records, her home, her belongings. If Richard was administering something, there might be traces. But we need to know what to look for first. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, hope, maybe, or purpose. This was familiar ground. Not so different from a mission brief, from identifying a target and planning an approach. Okay, she said. Let's do this. She pulled out her phone and dialed Richard Hayes's number, putting it on speaker. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice impatient. Richard Hayes. Mr. Hayes, this is Sarah Mitchell. I'm not sure if you remember me, I was a friend of Margaret's. A pause. Of course. The soldier. What can I do for you? His tone was polite but cold, the voice of a man checking off a social obligation. I heard about Atlas, Sarah said carefully. About how you're looking for a new home for him. I'd like to adopt him, if you're willing. Margaret meant a lot to me, and I know how much she loved that dog. Another pause, longer this time. When Richard spoke again, his voice had changed, sharpened with suspicion. Where did you hear that I was looking for a home for the dog? Sarah improvised. Someone at the funeral mentioned it. I'm sorry, I don't remember who. Is it not true? The dog is no longer at my property, Richard said slowly. He ran off yesterday. I've contacted animal control, but I assume he's long gone by now. Probably got hit by a car or something. Tragic, but these things happen. Sarah's blood ran cold. Jake's eyes narrowed dangerously. Oh, Sarah managed. I'm so sorry to hear that. If he shows up. If he shows up, I'll be sure to let the shelter know, Richard cut her off. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to get to. Goodbye, Sarah. He hung up without waiting for a response. Sarah and Jake stared at each other in the sudden silence. He just lied, Sarah said. Straight to my face. He didn't report Atlas missing. He didn't call animal control. He tied that dog to a tree and left him to die. And now he knows someone's asking questions, Jake added grimly. Which means we need to move faster than I thought. Atlas whined softly, as if sensing the tension in the room. Jake crouched down and looked the dog in the eyes. You're a smart one, aren't you? He murmured. I bet you know things. I bet you saw things in that house that would make our investigation a whole lot easier. Sarah watched as Jake continued to study Atlas with a professional's eye. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Jake said slowly, that Richard made a big mistake. See, when you work with military dogs, you learn that they're not just weapons or tools. They're witnesses. They remember scents, behaviors, routines. Atlas lived in that house for 3 years. He watched Richard and Margaret interact every single day. But he can't testify, Sarah pointed out. No, Jake agreed, but he can lead us. He can alert to specific scents. And if Richard was using some kind of poison or drug, that scent would be on items in the house, in places only Atlas would remember. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. You want to take Atlas back to the mansion? Not right away. First, I need to do some training with him, see how he responds to basic commands, see if he has any alert training from before Margaret rescued him. Based on how well-bred he is and his behavior patterns, I'm guessing he might have been a working dog at some point. Police K-9, maybe, or private security. And if he does have training? Jake's smile was cold and dangerous. Then Richard Hayes just lost his biggest advantage. Because Atlas is going to help us prove what that son of a bitch did to Margaret. The dog's ears perked up at the mention of Margaret's name, and his tail wagged once, twice. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Even now, even after everything, Atlas was still hoping his person would come back. We're going to get justice for her, Sarah promised the dog, her voice fierce. For both of you. Jake stood and grabbed his duffel bag. I'm going to need a few hours with Atlas. Somewhere quiet, open space. Is there a park nearby? There's a state forest about 15 minutes from here. Trails, open fields. It should be empty this early. Perfect. Jake looked at her seriously. Sarah, I need you to understand something. If we go down this road, if we start investigating Richard Hayes, we're committing. The man has money and lawyers and connections. If we're wrong, or if we can't prove it, he could make our lives very difficult. I know, Sarah said without hesitation. But Margaret saved me when I needed saving. And she asked me to protect Atlas. I'm not walking away. Jake nodded, and something like respect flickered across his face. Then let's get to work. And Mitchell? Watch your back. If Richard is willing to kill his wife for money, he won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in his way. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees of Pisgah National Forest as Jake worked with Atlas in a cleared meadow. Sarah watched from a fallen log, sipping coffee from a thermos, as man and dog moved through a series of exercises that looked deceptively simple but required incredible trust and communication. Heel, Jake commanded, and Atlas immediately fell into step beside him, matching his pace perfectly. Sit. Atlas sat. Down. The dog dropped to his belly without hesitation. Jake glanced at Sarah with raised eyebrows. This dog has definitely been trained before. These aren't tricks Margaret taught him. This is professional-level obedience. They'd been at it for 2 hours, and with each passing minute, it became clearer that Atlas was no ordinary rescue dog. He understood hand signals. He responded to German commands. He showed the kind of discipline that took months or years to develop. Who were you before Margaret found you? Jake murmured, running his hand over Atlas's head. And why were you abandoned? Sarah stood and walked over. Can you teach him to alert to specific scents? If he doesn't already know how, yes. But it'll take time, days, maybe weeks. Jake paused. Unless we can figure out what he was originally trained for. If he was a police K-9 or detection dog, he might already have the skills. We just need to trigger the memory. How do we do that? Jake thought for a moment, then pulled out his phone. I'm going to make some calls. There are databases for lost or retired K-9s. If Atlas was reported missing or retired out, there'll be a record. While Jake worked the phone, Sarah took over with Atlas. She'd grown up with dogs on her family's farm in Kentucky, before she'd enlisted to escape a dead-end life in a dying coal town. Being with Atlas now reminded her of those simpler times, before deployments and trauma, and learning that the world was a much darker place than she'd imagined. Good boy, she told Atlas as he performed a perfect recall across the meadow. You're so smart. Margaret knew that, didn't she? The dog's ears perked up at Margaret's name again, and his tail wagged hopefully. Sarah felt her throat tighten. The hope in Atlas's eyes was going to break her heart. Jake walked back over, his expression tense with excitement. I found him. Or at least, I found who he might be. Sarah straightened. What? 3 years ago, a German shepherd named Gunnar went missing from a private security company in Charlotte. He was a high-value asset, trained in personal protection, threat detection, and scent discrimination. Worth about 50 grand. Jesus, Sarah breathed. How does a $50,000 dog end up abandoned in a warehouse? That's the interesting part. Jake showed her his phone screen, where an article from a Charlotte newspaper was pulled up. The security company, Apex Protective Services, reported Gunner stolen during a break-in at their facility. The police investigated but never found him. The case went cold. Sarah scanned the article, then froze. Jake. Look at who owned Apex Protective Services. Jake looked, and his jaw tightened. Richard Hayes. They stared at each other as the pieces started falling into place. Richard owned a security company with a $50,000 dog, Sarah said slowly. That dog goes missing in a break-in. And then 6 months later, Margaret, who's been looking for a dog to help with her anxiety and depression, just happens to find the perfect German Shepherd at a shelter 2 hours away. It's not a coincidence, Jake finished. Richard planted Atlas with Margaret. But why? Jake crouched down, studying Atlas with new eyes. Because a personal protection dog stays close to its owner. It observes everything. It remembers everything. And if you wanted to keep tabs on someone, monitor their movements, know who they talked to and where they went, you'd give them a dog trained to do exactly that, Sarah whispered. Oh my God. Atlas was Richard's spy. But as soon as she said it, she knew something was off. Because Atlas had loved Margaret. The grief in his eyes was real. The way he'd stayed by her hospital bed, the way he'd refused to leave her grave, that wasn't the behavior of a dog following programming. No, Sarah said firmly. It doesn't make sense. If Richard sent Atlas to spy on Margaret, why did the dog bond so completely with her? Why did Richard treat him so badly? And why would he abandon Atlas after Margaret died? Jake nodded slowly. You're right. I think Richard did plant the dog originally. But something went wrong. Atlas chose Margaret, Sarah realized. He was supposed to be loyal to Richard, but he fell in love with Margaret instead. And Richard couldn't control him anymore. Jake stood, pacing now. Which means Atlas is more than just a witness. He might have actively protected Margaret from Richard. He might have interfered with whatever Richard was trying to do. A memory surfaced in Sarah's mind, something Margaret had mentioned in passing during one of their phone calls. Margaret told me once that Atlas didn't like Richard. She thought it was funny. Said the dog would put himself between them whenever Richard raised his voice. She called Atlas her furry bodyguard. Protection behavior, Jake confirmed. If Richard was trying to poison Margaret slowly, Atlas would have noticed. Dogs can detect chemical changes in their owner's body, cortisol, adrenaline, even blood sugar. If Margaret was being poisoned, Atlas would have known something was wrong. And Richard would have seen the dog as a threat, Sarah added. That's why he neglected him. That's why he was so eager to get rid of him after Margaret died. Jake pulled out his phone again. I need to call my toxicology friend right now. If we're right about this, we need to know what to look for. And we need to search that house before Richard has a chance to clean up the evidence. We can't just break in, Sarah pointed out. No, Jake agreed, but we can visit as concerned friends of Margaret's. We can ask to collect some of her belongings, items she might have wanted you to have. It's reasonable. He might even let us in just to maintain appearances. And while we're there, Atlas comes with us. If there are traces of poison, chemicals that don't belong, he'll alert to them, especially if they're associated with Margaret's suffering. Sarah looked at the dog, who was sitting patiently between them, watching their faces as if trying to understand every word. She thought about Margaret, dying in that house while her husband slowly killed her. She thought about Atlas, watching helplessly as the person he loved most in the world grew weaker every day. When do we go? She asked. Tonight, Jake decided. Richard will be relaxed, thinking he's gotten away with it. He'll be less guarded. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Jake worked on reinforcing Atlas's training, using various scents to teach him to alert to chemical compounds. Sarah made calls, gathering information about Richard's business dealings and financial situation. What she found was disturbing. Apex Protective Services had gone bankrupt 2 years ago, folded under a mountain of debt and lawsuits. Richard had personally guaranteed many of the loans. But Margaret's family trust, which she controlled, had refused to bail him out. She'd told him he needed to face the consequences of his poor business decisions. That must have been when Richard started planning, Sarah thought. When he realized his wife wasn't going to save him, that she was going to let him fail. Margaret's estate was worth $20 million. With her gone, and no children from their marriage, everything went to Richard by default. Unless she'd managed to change her will before she died. Sarah called the law firm listed in Margaret's old will, a document from 10 years ago that she'd mentioned to Sarah once. The receptionist confirmed that Margaret had indeed made an appointment to update her will 3 months ago. But she'd cancelled it, saying she was too ill to come in. She'd never rescheduled. He didn't let her, Sarah told Jake when she hung up. He made sure she was too sick to change the will. Jake's expression was grim. Then we need to prove it. Tonight. As the sun set over the mountains, they drove to Biltmore Forest in Jake's truck, Atlas riding alert in the back seat. The dog seemed to sense the importance of what was happening. His ears were perked forward, his body tense but controlled. Richard's mansion loomed at the end of a tree-lined driveway, all its windows dark except for a light in what must be the study. Jake parked on the street, and they sat for a moment, mentally preparing. "You ready for this?" Jake asked Sarah. She nodded, her hand resting on the pistol concealed at her hip, her personal weapon, legally carried. "Let's go get justice for Margaret." They approached the front door together, Atlas walking calmly between them on a leash. Sarah rang the doorbell. Richard Hayes opened the door wearing expensive loungewear, a glass of scotch in his hand. His expression shifted from annoyance to surprise when he saw Sarah, then to something harder when his eyes fell on Atlas. "The dog didn't run away after all," he said coldly. "No," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I found him tied to a tree in your backyard. Starving and abandoned. So I took him." Richard's face flushed with anger. "That's theft. I could have you arrested." "You told me this morning that Atlas ran away," Sarah countered. "So how can I steal a dog you don't have? Unless you lied to me about that." The silence stretched taut. Jake stepped forward slightly, his presence a subtle threat. "We're not here to argue," Jake said calmly. "We're here because Sarah wants to collect some of Margaret's belongings. Personal items. Surely you won't begrudge her that. She and Margaret were close." Richard's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake, clearly recognizing a military bearing when he saw one. "And you are?" "A friend," Jake replied simply. "Someone who cares about making sure Margaret's wishes are honored." Another long pause. Then Richard stepped back, opening the door wider. "Fine. 10 minutes. Take whatever you want from her bedroom. But the dog stays outside." "The dog stays with us," Sarah said firmly. Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in their expressions must have warned him off. He shrugged with false casualness. "Suit yourself. But if he damages anything, you're paying for it." They entered the mansion, and Sarah felt Atlas tense beneath her hand. The dog's ears were pinned back, his tail low. He didn't want to be here. "It's okay, buddy," Sarah whispered. "We're here for Margaret. You can do this." They followed Richard through a marble foyer and up a sweeping staircase. The house was exactly as Sarah remembered, cold, expensive, empty of any real warmth. All the money in the world couldn't make it feel like a home. Richard led them to the master bedroom and gestured vaguely at a closet. "Her things are in there. I haven't touched them yet. Take what you want and leave." He walked away, back toward the stairs, leaving them alone. Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. This was easier than they'd expected, which immediately made Sarah suspicious. But they didn't have time to question it. Jake unclipped Atlas's leash and gave him a quiet command in German. The dog's entire demeanor changed, shifting into work mode. He began moving through the room, nose to the ground, searching. Sarah started going through Margaret's closet, pulling out items that held meaning, a favorite sweater, some jewelry, photos. But her real attention was on Atlas. The dog moved systematically through the space, checking the bed, the nightstands, the bathroom. Then he stopped at Margaret's nightstand and sat, his gaze fixed on the drawer. Alert! Jake moved quickly, pulling on latex gloves he'd brought. He opened the drawer and found what looked like normal contents: reading glasses, hand lotion, a book, some medication bottles. Jake picked up the medication bottles one by one, examining them. Her cancer meds, he murmured. Painkillers. Anti-nausea medication. Nothing unusual. But Atlas was still sitting, still alerting. There was something else. Jake felt around the drawer, then underneath it. His fingers found something taped to the bottom, a small bottle, carefully hidden. He pulled it free. The label was partially scratched off, but Jake's expression darkened as he read what remained. Arsenic trioxide, he said quietly. In small doses, it can mimic or accelerate cancer symptoms. Nausea, fatigue, organ failure. And it's nearly impossible to detect without specifically looking for it during an autopsy. Sarah felt the world tilt. He poisoned her. Yeah, Jake confirmed grimly. He did. A sound from the doorway made them both spin around. Richard stood there, and he was holding a gun. I knew you'd come looking, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Margaret told me she'd talked to you, Sarah. Told me she'd asked you to watch out for the dog. I should have killed the animal months ago, but I didn't think anyone would care. I didn't think anyone would dig this deep. Sarah's hand moved toward her concealed weapon, but Richard raised his gun higher. Don't, he warned. I'm a very good shot. Jake shifted slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and the gun. This is over, Richard. We have the poison. We have witnesses. You can't kill all of us and make it look like an accident. Richard laughed, a harsh sound. Can't I? A veteran with PTSD breaks into my home with an unstable female soldier, threatens me with a dangerous dog. I defend myself. I'm a respected businessman. You're just two soldiers with questionable mental health. Who do you think the police will believe? He wasn't wrong. Sarah felt despair rising in her chest. They'd been so close. But they'd forgotten about one thing. They'd forgotten that Atlas wasn't just a witness. He was Margaret's protector. With a snarl that raised the hair on Sarah's neck, Atlas launched himself at Richard. 90 pounds of trained muscle and fury, moving faster than seemed possible. Richard's gun discharged, the shot going wild, and then Atlas was on him, taking him down to the floor. Richard screamed. The gun skittered away across the marble. Jake dove for it while Sarah rushed forward. Atlas, out. Jake commanded in German, and the dog immediately released Richard, backing away but staying alert, ready to attack again if needed. Richard curled on the floor, his arm bleeding where Atlas had bitten him, his face pale with shock and pain. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking with adrenaline. This is Sarah Mitchell. I need police and an ambulance at the Hayes residence in Biltmore Forest. We've just stopped a murder from happening, and we have evidence that Richard Hayes killed his wife. As she gave the address, Jake kept Richard's gun trained on him, while Atlas stood guard, no longer a grieving pet but a warrior doing what he'd been trained to do all along. Protect. Serve. And never let the bad guys win. The police arrived within 8 minutes, flooding the mansion with lights and authority. Sarah sat on the front steps with Atlas beside her, watching as paramedics treated Richard's arm while officers took their statements. Jake stood nearby, his military ID and credentials giving him credibility that made the responding officers listen carefully to his account of events. Detective Linda Morrison of the Asheville Police Department was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She examined the bottle of arsenic trioxide that Jake had carefully preserved as evidence, then looked at Atlas with open respect. "This dog found this hidden in the drawer?" she asked. "He's trained in scent detection," Jake explained. "He alerted to the chemical compound. Without him, we never would have found it." Morrison nodded slowly. "And you're saying Richard Hayes administered this to his wife over a period of months, accelerating her cancer to kill her for her inheritance?" "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "Margaret told me 3 months ago that she was going to change her will. She told me her husband wasn't who she thought he was. And she asked me to protect Atlas because she knew Richard would get rid of him the moment she died." "Because the dog knew," Morrison said, understanding dawning. "The dog witnessed it." "More than that," Jake added. "Atlas actively tried to protect Margaret. Richard couldn't poison her easily when the dog was around. That's why he starved Atlas, isolated him, tried to make him too weak to interfere. And when Margaret died, Richard abandoned him immediately because Atlas was the only living witness to what happened in that house." Morrison looked at Richard, who was sitting in the back of an ambulance, handcuffed despite the paramedics' protests. His expensive clothes were torn and bloody, his carefully styled hair disheveled. He looked small suddenly, stripped of his wealth and power. "We'll need to get Margaret's medical records," Morrison said. "And we'll have to exhume her body to test for arsenic levels." "She was cremated," Sarah said, her voice heavy with regret. Morrison's expression flickered with frustration, but then she shook her head. "Doesn't matter. If he was administering arsenic for months, there'll be traces in her personal items, her bathroom, her toothbrush, her makeup. And we have this bottle. We can match the chemical signature. Plus, we have his attempted murder of you two tonight, which gives us enough to hold him while we build the case." Jake stepped forward. "Detective, there's something else you should know. Richard Hayes used to own a private security company. Atlas, we think his original name was Gunner, was reported stolen from that company 3 years ago. We believe Richard deliberately arranged for the dog to be found by Margaret so he could use Gunner to monitor her movements and activities. But it backfired," Morrison said slowly, "because the dog bonded with Margaret instead." "Exactly." Morrison turned to one of her officers. "Get me everything on Richard Hayes. Financial records, business dealings, phone records, emails. I want to know every move this man made in the last 3 years." She looked back at Sarah and Jake. "This is going to take time. Months, probably. Can you both stick around as witnesses?" Sarah nodded. "I'm on leave for another 2 weeks. After that, I'll come back whenever you need me." "I can arrange time away from base," Jake added. "This is important." "Good." Morrison looked down at Atlas, who was sitting calmly beside Sarah, his dark eyes watching everything with that uncanny intelligence. "And the dog? What happens to him now?" Sarah's hand dropped to Atlas's head, and the dog leaned into her touch. "He's mine. Margaret asked me to take care of him, and that's what I'm going to do. Military housing allows dogs. Some bases do. If mine doesn't, I'll figure something out." Sarah's voice was firm. "Atlas isn't going to be abandoned again. Not ever." Morrison smiled slightly. "Good. He's earned a good home." She paused. "You know, if things had gone differently tonight, if Richard had shot one or both of you, we might never have known what he did to Margaret. That dog saved more than just your lives. He saved his owner's memory, her justice." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at Atlas, at this incredible animal who'd stayed loyal to Margaret even through starvation and abuse, who protected them tonight despite everything he'd suffered. He's a hero, Sarah said quietly. Margaret always said he was. I just didn't understand until now. The trial took 9 months. Sarah returned to Asheville 4 times to testify, and each time she brought Atlas with her. Jake testified too, explaining the dog's training and how his alert to the arsenic trioxide had broken the case open. The prosecution built a devastating case against Richard Hayes. They found traces of arsenic in Margaret's bathroom, in her vitamin bottles, even in her favorite coffee mug. They proved that Richard had been deeply in debt, that his businesses were failing, and that he'd systematically isolated Margaret from her friends and family in the months before her death. They also proved that Richard had falsified the report about Gunner being stolen, that he deliberately placed the dog with Margaret using a friend who worked at the rescue shelter, and that he'd monitored Margaret's communications through software installed on her phone and computer. But it was Atlas who sealed Richard's fate. The judge allowed the dog to be present in court as evidence, and when the prosecution demonstrated how Atlas could detect the same chemical compound that had killed Margaret, several jurors visibly teared up. Here was a dog who'd loved his owner so much that he continued to protect her memory even after her death, who'd led investigators to the truth despite every attempt to silence him. Richard Hayes was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. On the day the verdict came down, Sarah stood outside the courthouse with Jake and Atlas, facing a crowd of reporters. Margaret's story had captured national attention, the wealthy woman murdered by her husband, the rescue dog who'd saved her honor, the female veteran who'd refused to give up on a promise. How does it feel to get justice for Margaret? One reporter called out. Sarah looked at Atlas, who was sitting calmly beside her, a hero's medal around his neck, awarded by the Asheville Police Department for his service in solving the case. It doesn't bring her back, Sarah said honestly. But it means her life mattered. It means her death won't be forgotten or brushed aside. And it means Atlas can finally rest, knowing he did everything he could to protect the person he loved. What are your plans now? Another reporter asked. Jake stepped forward. I'm starting a K-9 training program for veterans with PTSD. Atlas is going to be our first demonstration dog. We're going to teach other dogs to do what he does, protect, serve, and save lives. And I'm going back to active duty, Sarah added. But I'm also starting a foundation in Margaret's name. We're going to help military spouses who are in abusive or controlling relationships. We're going to make sure no one else suffers in silence like Margaret did. The questions continued, but Sarah barely heard them. She was looking at Jake, at this man who dropped everything to help her keep a promise, who believed her when everyone else would have called her crazy. Thank you, she said quietly, knowing he'd hear her even over the crowd noise. Jake smiled. You'd have done the same for me. That's what we do. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the backyard of a small house she'd rented near Fort Bragg, watching as Atlas played with 3 other German shepherds, rescue dogs that Jake was training for his new program. The dogs ran and wrestled and were just dogs for once, not soldiers or protectors or heroes. Just happy animals enjoying the sunshine. Her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something made her answer. Is this Sarah Mitchell? A woman's voice asked. Yes. My name is Elizabeth Hayes. I'm Margaret's sister. Sarah's breath caught. She tried to find Margaret's family during the trial, but Richard had isolated Margaret so completely that even her own relatives had lost touch with her. I'm so sorry, Sarah said immediately. I wish I'd known sooner. I wish I could have saved her. You did save her, Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved her reputation. You made sure the world knew she didn't just give up and die. You proved that she was murdered, that she mattered. A pause. I wanted to thank you. And I wanted you to know that the family has established a trust in Margaret's name. Half will go to your foundation. The other half is designated for Atlas's care, for his lifetime, and for any other dogs in Jake's program. Sarah felt tears stream down her face. Elizabeth, that's too much. It's not enough, Elizabeth interrupted gently. My sister loved that dog more than anything. She talked about him constantly in the few phone calls Richard allowed us to have. She said he was her guardian angel. And she was right. He protected her even after death. Please accept this. It's what she would have wanted. Okay, Sarah whispered. Thank you. After they hung up, Sarah walked out to where Atlas was resting under a tree, panting happily after his play session. She sat beside him, and the dog immediately laid his head in her lap, looking up at her with those deep brown eyes that had seen so much sorrow but still held so much love. Did you hear that, buddy? Sarah said softly. Margaret's sister called. The family wants to help. They remember how much Margaret loved you. Atlas's tail thumped against the ground. Sarah ran her hand over the dog's head, thinking about everything that had happened since that rainy day at Margaret's funeral. How a simple promise had turned into an investigation, a trial, a mission. How one dog's loyalty had exposed a killer and changed so many lives. Jake walked over and sat down on Atlas's other side. The dog, spoiled now by all the attention, rolled onto his back for belly rubs from both of them. He's gained 20 pounds, Jake observed. Looks healthy. He looks happy, Sarah corrected. That's what matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just two veterans and a hero dog, enjoying a peaceful moment in a world that so often lacked peace. You ever think about getting out? Jake asked eventually. The military, I mean. Settling down somewhere quiet. Sarah considered it. A year ago, she would have said no without hesitation. The military was her life, her identity, the only place she'd ever truly belonged. But now, watching Atlas sleep contentedly in the sun, thinking about the foundation she was building and the lives it would touch, she wasn't so sure. Maybe someday, she said. When I've done enough. When I've kept enough promises. Jake smiled. Let me know when that day comes. I'll save a spot for you in the program. We could use someone like you training the handlers. Someone like me. Someone who understands that these dogs aren't just tools or weapons. They're partners. Family. Worth fighting for. Jake looked at her seriously. Someone who won't give up on them when it gets hard. Sarah thought about Margaret, who'd driven 2 hours to rescue a supposedly abandoned dog. Who'd loved him unconditionally despite her husband's complaints. Who'd known, even at the end, that Atlas would protect her memory. She thought about all the other dogs and people who needed someone to fight for them, to refuse to give up, to keep promises even when it seemed impossible. Yeah, she said finally. I think I'd like that. When the time comes. Atlas stirred in his sleep, and Sarah could have sworn he was smiling. 3 years after Margaret's death, on a sunny October afternoon, a small ceremony was held at the Asheville City Park. A bronze statue was unveiled, a woman sitting on a bench with a German shepherd at her feet, the dog's head resting on her knee in an eternal gesture of devotion. The plaque read. Asterisk in memory of Margaret Hayes and Atlas. She saved him. He saved her memory. Let their story remind us that loyalty transcends death. That promises matter, and that justice is worth fighting for, asterisk. Sarah stood with Jake and Atlas, older now, his muzzle gray, but still strong and dignified, as Margaret's family and friends gathered to pay their respects. Elizabeth Hayes gave a beautiful speech about her sister's kindness and strength. The mayor spoke about the importance of the Domestic Violence Foundation that bore Margaret's name. But it was Sarah's words that made people cry. Margaret told me once that she didn't rescue Atlas, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the quiet park. She said Atlas rescued her. He gave her purpose when she felt lost. He gave her unconditional love when she felt alone. And when the worst happened, when someone she trusted betrayed her in the most horrible way, Atlas made sure the truth came out. He made sure she wasn't forgotten. Sarah looked down at Atlas, who was sitting beside her, his award medals glinting in the sunlight. We think of dogs as pets, Sarah continued. As companions. And they are. But they're also warriors. Guardians. Heroes. They fight for us even when we can't fight for ourselves. They protect us even when it costs them everything. And they love us with a purity that we humans can barely comprehend. She paused, collecting herself. Margaret saved Atlas from death and abuse. And Atlas saved Margaret's memory and her legacy. That's not just a story about a woman and her dog. That's a story about what we owe each other, to fight for justice, to keep our promises, to never give up on those we love. So today, we honor both of them. And we remember that sometimes the bravest warriors have 4 legs and a tail, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who simply refuse to let the bad guys win. The crowd applauded, but Sarah barely heard it. She was looking at the statue, at the artist's perfect capture of Margaret's gentle smile and Atlas's devoted gaze. You can rest now, Sarah thought toward her lost friend. We got him. We made sure everyone knows what you meant to Atlas, and what he meant to you. You can both rest, That evening, Sarah and Jake sat on Sarah's back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Atlas lay between them, peaceful and content. He spent most of his days with Sarah now, officially retired from active training but occasionally brought in to help evaluate new dogs for the program. You know what Margaret would say if she could see all this? Jake said suddenly. What? Thank you for keeping your promise. Jake smiled. And probably that she knew you had it in you all along. Sarah laughed, wiping at unexpected tears. She always believed in me more than I believed in myself. That's what good mentors do. Jake paused. And now you're doing the same thing for other people. The foundation has helped 50 women so far? 63, Sarah corrected. And their children and pets. We got 2 women and their dogs into safe housing just last week. Margaret would be proud. I hope so. Sarah's hand found Atlas's head, scratching behind his ears the way he liked. I hope they both know, Margaret and Atlas, that they changed things. That their story mattered. Atlas's tail thumped against the porch floor, and Sarah chose to believe he understood. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the world in that soft blue twilight that Sarah had always found beautiful. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer by, one of Jake's trainees howled, and Atlas's ears perked up, but he didn't move from his spot between his 2 favorite humans. Sarah thought about the long road that had brought her here, from a scared farm girl in Kentucky, to a female soldier constantly fighting to prove herself, to a woman who'd stumbled into a murder investigation because she'd made a promise to a dying friend. She thought about how easy it would have been to walk away. To let Richard get away with it. To assume no one would believe her, or that Atlas was just a dog and his suffering didn't matter. But she hadn't walked away. And neither had Jake. And together, with a remarkable dog who'd refused to stop fighting for the person he loved, they'd gotten justice. You know what I learned from all this? Sarah said quietly. What? That being underestimated is sometimes an advantage. Richard thought I was just some soldier friend of Margaret's, no threat to him. He thought Atlas was just a dog. He thought he could get away with it because who would care enough to dig deeper? Jake nodded. He didn't count on you being stubborn. Or Atlas being extraordinary. Or Margaret having chosen her friends wisely. No, Sarah agreed. He didn't. She looked at Atlas, at this dog who'd been trained as a tool, used as a spy, but who'd chosen love over programming. Who'd protected Margaret until his last breath, and who'd helped bring her killer to justice. Heroes came in all forms, Sarah had learned. Some wore uniforms and carried weapons. Some had 4 legs and a bark. And some were quiet women who kept promises no matter the cost. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah made a new promise, not to Margaret this time, but to herself and to all the people and animals who needed someone to fight for them. She promised to never stop believing that justice mattered. That loyalty mattered. That keeping your word mattered. She promised to be the person Margaret had always seen in her, someone strong enough to stand up against evil, brave enough to fight for the voiceless, stubborn enough to never give up. And beside her, Atlas slept peacefully, his work finally done, his honor finally restored, a hero at last recognized for what he'd always been. The dog who saved a memory. The dog who brought a killer to justice. The dog who proved that sometimes, the most powerful weapon in the world is simply refusing to stop loving someone, even after they're gone.